Big league pitcher Mark Fidrich used to talk to the baseball before and after throwing it. And all of us, I think, at times do have conversations with inanimate things. Usually those conversations involve a tool or other object that isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing. And most of those conversations begin, "You useless piece of," well, you know how that conversation goes. But what if the object started to talk back? And that's where we get to The Book of Form and Emptiness by Ruth Ozeki, about a boy who does have conversations with the inanimate world. I would argue, as I say, that we all have those conversations. We just don't have writers like Ruth Ozeki who help us understand what it all means.
Seems like a year, sweetheart, when you are not near. Tell me that you will be true. My happiness, it all depends on you. Sometimes I'm happy, sometimes I'm blue. My disposition depends on you. I never mind the rain from the skies if I can find the sun in your eyes.
All right, this show has been so much fun to prepare for. And I worked with Lily Tyson. I get to pick out some of the music for this show. And so that's this song that you just heard is mentioned in this novel we're about to talk about. This novel is saturated in so many wonderful things, including music. And I'm going to say that I wanted to play this particular version of this particular song, which is the favorite song of a character in the book, because of the verse at the beginning, which a lot of people don't sing. The verse is that kind of slow part at the beginning of a jazz standard. But it describes a lot of things that are not exactly in the main part of the song, but are in the book. What book am I talking about? Why won't I shut up? Those are all very good questions. We are here to talk about The Book of Form and Emptiness. It is written by Ruth Ozeki. Her previous books include My Year of Meats and A Tale for the Time Being, a finalist for the Booker Prize. Born in New Haven, living in Northampton now. So we're basically, at a midpoint between two phases of her life, because we're sitting here in Hartford right now. And she's joining us right now. Very excited about this book. Very excited to talk about a lot of the themes in it. Ruth Ozeki, welcome to our conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm sitting here just cracking up. I was so happy to hear that song. That's such an amazing rendition of it too. Thank you for finding that.
Yeah, the name of the singer is Amy Yassinger, which kind of rhymes with jazz singer. That's how you remember
excellent.
It. I wanted that verse there too, because I think it describes very specifically the longing at the beginning of this book as the mother of the protagonist, Benji, loses her beloved husband and partner and everything, Kenji, and that's his favorite song. He's a musician, but so much of the beginning of the book is about that very specific kind of longing experienced by Annabelle, not Kenji. So, but there's so much to talk about, and we'll get to know you and some stuff about your life as we go along here. But I want to begin with one of the basic ideas of this book, which is this notion of animation, of the idea that the unsentient thing, that the so-called inanimate things in our lives are in fact, at least within the reality of this book, they speak, they have agency, they have agendas. Maybe say a little bit more about that vision and the way it informs the plot of this book.
Sure. Oh, what a wonderful place to start. Thank you for thinking of that. Because animation was really something that was, sort of going through my mind a lot. As a former filmmaker, first of all, I sort of think in filmic terms. But I was thinking too about the way that children's animation, in children's animation, objects, insentient things are full of life. They're vibrant, they're vital, they dance around, they speak, they have opinions, they have agency, they have all of those things, right? And then somewhere along the line, we lose our ability to sense that, to imagine that, and things become inanimate and kind of dead. And the world is a much livelier place if, when the objects, the things around you, when you can invest them with that kind of vibrancy. So that was something that I was certainly thinking about as I was writing this, and I think to some extent, I was thinking about things like, having to clear out my parents' house in New Haven after they died, and about the objects there, every single one of which had some kind of story attached to it. And even if I didn't know the story, I could sense it. And I found myself just wishing over and over again that, that these objects could speak so that I could know more about where they came from and the stories that they held inside. So that was certainly part of what was inspiring me to write Annabelle, who has, as you say, lost her beloved, and can't bring herself to throw away his flannel shirts because they still have his aura, his essence sort of clinging to the weave.
Or of course, it turns out she can't bear to throw out anything, but that's a separate
too.
story. So, so this idea of kind of hearing voices of being constantly spoken to by the so-called inanimate world is the dilemma, is the plight in which Benji, your protagonist, finds himself in. He can't walk anywhere essentially without all these things talking to them, and they're really talking to him too. They have information that seems quite valid. But I love the point that you made about that idea, is that as children we are confronted with a culture that does grant that kind of animation and agency to this cat. We're going to go to A2 right now.
What's up there?
Where? There? Oh, nothing. Absolutely nothing of interest at all in the West Wing. Dusty, dull, very boring.
Ah, so that's the West Wing.
Nice going.
I wonder what he's hiding up there.
Hiding? The master is hiding nothing.
Then it wouldn't be forbidden.
Perhaps, Mademoiselle would like to see something else. We have exquisite tapestries dating all the way back to...
Maybe later.
The gardens or the library, perhaps.
You have a library?
Oh, yes. Yeah, oh, indeed.
With books?
Cans of books.
Mountains of books.
Forests of books.
Cascades.
Cloudbursts.
Swamps of books.
More books than you'll ever be able to read in a lifetime. Books on every subject ever studied, like every author who ever set pen to paper.
Okay, that of course is from Beauty and the Beast, the animated version. The people talking, in addition to Belle, similar name to Annabelle, are a clock and a candelabra. And so there's a lot in that clip that's in this book too, and including the stuff about books at the end. And we'll come to that in a second. But there's a way in which Benji, Ruth, is obviously he's kind of stigmatized. He's defined because it's okay to talk to your car or your toaster, but it's not okay if your car or your toaster talks back. So he's identified as having a schizoaffective disorder. He's hospitalized. But I don't know. As I was reading it, first of all, I started thinking about Cocteau's Beauty and the Beast, but then I started thinking about this too. I mean, the truth is, as kids and really as we grow up, it's not true that we don't talk to the things around us, right?
I think that's really true. I am constantly having conversations with the things around me. And I really do, sometimes think that they talk back, but I was also interested in this idea, as a writer, as a novelist, things are talking to me all the time. I very often, when I talk to people about writing novels, I'll say things, I'll hear myself saying things like, well, characters come to me as voices. Right. And so I started thinking about that. Like, what does that mean? And I remember I was describing it like this at a library event, actually, in Michigan, I think it was. And one of the audience members raised his hand. He was a middle-aged man. And he said, when you talk about characters hearing voices, are you talking about hearing them, sort of with your mind as though it's inside your head? Or are you actually hearing them with your ear as if it's outside your head? right? And I knew immediately the distinction that he was making, because I have also heard voices outside my head, as if with my ear. And that was after my dad died. And for about a year after that, I would occasionally hear him, I'd be doing something like washing the dishes or ironing or whatever. And I would hear him clear his throat and say my name. And it felt exactly as if he was standing sort of in the room, but, behind me on my right-hand side. It was always the same place, right? And I'd whip around and look, right? And expect to see him there. And then suddenly I would remember, no, of course, he's gone, he's dead, and would feel, all of that sense of that grief and loss all over again. These things happen so quickly, though, they happened so quickly and they disappeared so quickly. I just kind of would shake my head and forget about it, move on. But I have had that experience, of hearing a voice as though it's outside my head. And so, it seems to me that there's kind of a spectrum here of voice hearing, the kind that come from the outside, the kind that, come from the inside. I mean, then of course they're as a writer, there's that whole army of voices that are inside, the critical voices that are telling me like all the time that, my writing sucks and I should probably just give up and go out and get a job. They're those voices too. So it seems to me that there's a vast array of voices, that we can talk about here.
Right. And I think we're going to swing back. I think sort of Benji has sort of two quote unquote problems, and one of them is hearing voices. And I want to sort of segregate that and talk a little bit more specifically about that later. The other problem that he has that is of course conjoined to the first problem is that idea of inanimate things being alive and making demands and wanting to be heard. And at one point early on, he gets in trouble because a window is talking to him because a sparrow has just flown into the window. It's in his classroom at school, so it's a little bit awkward because he has to deal with this window. Nobody else can hear the window saying anything, but the window has very specific issues, and he wants to talk about how it used to be sand. But and the other thing that I remembered is, and I don't know, somebody must have mentioned this podcast to you by now, now that the book is out. Do you know about the podcast Everything is Alive?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
So we want to play for the listeners. There's actually an episode of Everything is Alive where a pane of glass does in fact talk a little bit about what's going on, even in a specific situation pretty close to what Benji experiences. So yeah, let's do A1 here.
So Chioki, tell me about the time the bird flew into you.
Oh, man. Well, I'll tell you about the first time the bird flew into me. So in the sky one day, there were some birds kind of circling, doing their bird existence. And one bird seems to have a kind of close angle of approach. I thought, hey, if he keeps flying like this, he's not going to make that branch. But then he overshot the branch and was still headed toward me.
Yeah.
And then I thought, oh, well, this isn't going to be good at all. And he hit me so hard. I mean, like feathers flying everywhere. And then how birds are. He did that thing where he fell like for a bit and then caught the wind and then kind of flew off crookedly.
Did it hurt you?
It was a feeling of impact. It was an unexpected feeling of impact. I don't know that I feel pain, but I guess that I feel enough empathy that the bird's pain was also my pain.
Yeah.
I mean, he was more surprised than I was. I obviously saw him coming the whole time, and he for sure did not see me.
How does that feel? Like that you could be mistaken for nothing?
I mean, I guess that it's a feeling of, I know something you don't know, and you're about to find out in 3, 2, that kind of thing.
So,
That's
Ruth,
great.
Yeah.
That is great.
So,
that is great.
But I think also, we've sort of said this already, but I want to say it a little bit more specifically. I don't know. We think it's okay to have conversations with inanimate objects when we want to curse them out, whether it's a screwdriver that's slipping out or a toaster that doesn't work. I mean, we call them names. I had a friend who had a car who she had named Flattery. It wasn't a very good car, and it was named Flattery because it would get you nowhere. But she would yell at Flattery, God damn it, Flattery. But so we do that. And I don't know exactly what we're thinking, but I don't think it's true that the inanimate world is as flat to us as we like to pretend. I mean, Benji is pathologized, but he's pathologized for a relationship with the world that's not that different from ours.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I think that's really true. And what you're saying about, about cursing objects out when they displease us, right, is one thing. But, one of the things that was really interesting to me was when Marie Kondo came onto the scene, and she starts advocating an entirely different kind of relationship with objects that, for example, if you've had a pair of socks that have served you well and have developed holes as a result of your heels, that instead of just throwing the socks out, you should hold them in your hands and feel a moment, take the time to feel a moment of gratitude and then throw them out, and so it's kind of a beautiful thing, but again, it really, I thought it was very interesting because, that sensibility is very Japanese. And so really, I think what Marie Kondo is doing is kind of teaching Japanese culture 101, but in a Western context, it seems odd, perhaps, or strange.
Well, could you say a little bit more about the cultural piece of this? Because, I mean, I've only been to Japan once, but I got, I think, a little bit of a sense of it. And I know less than I should about Buddhism, but we should say you're a Buddhist priest in addition to everything else we're talking about. So to what degree does that connect to this notion that infuses your book, the Book of Form and Emptiness, that, in fact, we're much more connected to unsentient things?
Well, so Benny is, he's part Japanese, part Korean, and then, on his father's side, and then on his mother's side, he's Anglo. Yeah. And so, he has this connection to Japan. His father, Kenji, grew up in Japan as well. But there's also a character in the book who is, sort of based loosely on the Marie Kondo type of figure. She's a Japanese Zen nun, right? And she's written a book called Tidy Magic, and she did this in order to raise money to save the dilapidated temple that she's inherited from her teacher. But the book that she's written becomes a kind of international bestseller, and suddenly she's in this situation where the quiet temple life that she'd hoped for has suddenly been completely blown out of the water, and it's impossible for her. But the idea there, I sort of wanted to sort of bring up the contrast between the way that objects are viewed in Japan and then the way that they're the kind of disposability of objects in our culture. In our culture, obsolescence is it's designed into the object, right? It's a feature, not a bug. Whereas, in Japan, and especially traditionally, objects were really treasured, and they were passed, on from generation to generation. And, when an object broke, I mean, for example, like a needle or a pin, these were very precious things to women, when they couldn't be mass produced, right? So, you'd have this precious needle that you'd saved, and then it would break. And instead of throwing it out, you would, keep it until, once a year, there'd be a ceremony at the local shrine or temple. And then you'd bring the broken needle to the temple, and you would, on the altar, there would be a block of tofu, right? And so then you would insert your broken needle into the tofu so that your needle could have a soft resting place. And then there'd be a service, a ceremony, sort of memorial and gratitude for all of the broken needles and pins in the village. And then they would be, sort of thanked and sent off, to the afterlife. Yes, it's elaborate and, time consuming, but it's also there's something very beautiful about that. And I should also mention that, there's a little bit of insurance in there too, because needles and pins are sharp, even when they're broken, and they can hurt you if you don't respect them properly. So there's a little bit of insurance built into this ceremony as well.
Right. Like so many things in Japanese culture, at least the way that I understand it from my very amateur stance, is there's such an interesting tension there too, because Japanese culture also has this kind of celebration and exploration of the idea of impermanence, the kind of wabi-sabi aesthetic, that idea that because I think there are things here in the West that we want to cover up impermanence, particularly the impermanence of us and everything that we create. And Japanese culture, although they might attach quite a bit of sentiment to a needle that has, a knitting needle or something that's outlived its usefulness, there's also this notion of all things pass, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I think in this culture we tend to take impermanence very personally, right? And so then
You mean me?
You mean me? It's fine for everybody else, but what, me?
Right. So just for people who maybe are blanking a little bit on the name Marie Kondo, let's remind. So in Marie Kondo, we should say, as is being suggested, there's a character in this book who isn't Marie Kondo, but who reminds us of Marie Kondo. Not only that, but her book, which we have to come to this part too. Her book decides that it's going to jump into a shopping cart of somebody who needs it. But let's hear. This is B4, Kat. Let's do that.
I will teach you everything you need to know, from folding techniques and storage solution to discovering what sparks joy for you. Get ready to experience the life-changing magic of tidying up.
So Benny's mother, Annabelle, really kind of needs this badly because, as we said, she can't throw anything out. But, there's sort of a way in which we did a whole show about Marie Kondo.
Cool.
Marie Kondo did not appear on that show, but like lots of other people did. So there's a way in which she is butting up a little bit, I think, against the idea. I mean, there's that whole idea, it doesn't spark joy and you get rid of it. But there's also this kind of underlying question. Do we owe anything to the inanimate objects in our lives? Do we have any other relationship to them other than this rather one-sided idea, well, you don't spark joy in me anymore, so out you go. I don't know. Do you have a different take on that?
I think that's where, I own so many objects that don't spark joy. So, I'm probably not the one to ask. After I read Tidy Magic, and after reading that, I kind of looked around and I just felt my heart sink, And I just thought, seriously, I've got to get rid of like the stapler. The stapler does not spark joy, but I use it, but it's true. It's a cheap plastic stapler. And if I could buy another stapler, I'd buy a metal stapler. Yes, that's what I'll do. Right. And then I stopped myself and realized, no, I can't go replace everything in my house, with something that sparks joy. So I don't know. I mean, I think that, I understand what she's talking about, put it that way. I do understand, the difference between, picking up a cheap ballpoint pen and sitting down and, writing on, sort of a scrap of cheap paper versus holding a really beautiful fountain pen and, writing on like some beautiful piece of paper. Actually, I very often find it easier to write with the cheap ballpoint pen because it's not so precious, right? It doesn't spark joy, but it's precisely because I don't have the expectation, around it that I can kind of relax a little bit. So I don't know. I just think that, that our relationship with things is very complicated. That's all I'm trying to say. And, we have all sorts of different reactions to all of our different, the things that surround us. And I do think it's worth thinking about that. And especially especially I think it's worth thinking about objects that we, that we buy lots of, and, that do have a kind of planned obsolescence built into them that we're going to simply have to throw away, in a very short period of time, and buy new things, because, it seems that, the climate crisis that we're facing now, has something to do with this, right? So I think it's a conversation worth having with ourselves.
Right. And at one point, we haven't even mentioned the fact that a book is one of the big characters kind of in this book. And at one point, the book gives us all kind of a tongue lashing or a page lashing or something like that, whatever books lash at you with, about exactly what you just described, and says, and it kind of says, but, a reckoning is coming. And so that's very much there. We're talking to Ruth Ozeki. Her book is a novel, The Book of Form and Emptiness. I just have to say, this is just this kind of huge, big, sprawling. It's like if Dickens wrote a South American magical realism novel or something. It's got really great, colorful characters and this tremendous plot, and Benny being kind of very much a Dickens kind of hero, someone who's buffeted by fates that he cannot easily control. And it's great fun, and it's also very, very absorbing and poignant. We're going to take a little break here. When we come back, we're going to talk very specifically about the idea of hearing voices.
Is it 1 love for 2 for you, our guest? She's our guest. She's our guest. She's our guest. Be our guest. Be our guest. From the lands of the west. It's 10 years since we've had anybody here, and we're obsessed with your deal, with your ears. Yes, indeed, we're to peace. While the candlelight's still glowing, let us help you with it going.
Hansel and Gretel are alive and well, and they're living in Berlin. She is a cocktail waitress. He had a part in a Fassbinder film, and they sit around at night now.
That's Laurie Anderson, The Dream Before. I think you're just going to have to read Ruth Ozeki's book, The Book of Form and Emptiness, to understand why that's part of our show today. But we've tried to pick out some music that is very much part of the fabric of the show, of the book, rather. So, Ruth, I said sort of that Benny has these conjoined problems. One of them is the kind of animated nature of the supposedly inanimate world for him. And then the other problem is that is taking the form of him very specifically hearing voices. And at the risk of turning into this person who keeps saying, well, we did a show about this and we did a show about that. We did do a show about hearing voices. And I want to play, it's 7 years old. I don't know where any of these people are anymore. This is a man named Peter Bullimore. He's a voice hearer. He was the founding member of something called the Paranoia Network in England. He holds a teaching and research post at Manchester University, or did at the time, and was a published author on issues of voices and trauma. So you're going to hear my voice talking to him, and then I'm going to have Ruth react to this. Go ahead. When you say voices, is it I'm trying to just imagine the auditory experience of this. So is it voices that seem assignable to specific personalities? Is it just a cacophony of voices, each one kind of different from the other? Or?
It's different for me. I hear 3 externally through my right ear, and now they were the people that abused me as a child. I hear the voice of my dead mother, who's been dead for quite a long time now, and she makes very accurate predictions within my life. And I hear another voice, which I think is my creative side, that got crushed through childhood experiences, and that voice was very helpful. It helped me write a children's book. But when the book got published, the voice disappeared.
Our other authors have had that experience too. I think Philip K. Dick among them, who heard a specific female voice for a lot. I think starting in his teenage years and going into his writing career, Philip K. Dick, who probably is the most per words written movie adapted author in the history of at least the English language anyway. But he some of his creativity, and you hear this over and over again, whether it's him or Robert Schumann, who was having a considerably less pleasant experience, that for creative people often they do hear voices.
Yeah, I think so. And I couldn't have wrote the book without the voice.
So there you go. You were talking about
Yeah.
this before, Ruth Ozeki. There's kind of a fine line between the possibly institutionalizable hearer of voices and the creative person who is channeling something. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about how you relate to that.
Sure. I that was very, very interesting. One thing I thought was interesting was that I'll be specific here, is that he heard it with his right ear. And that's where I heard my dad's voice as well. I definitely heard it with my right ear, sort of behind me. One of the things that I realized as I was thinking about this, as I was thinking about writing this book and starting to research this experience of voice hearing, as well as, not just voice hearing, but also, this idea of unshared experiences that an individual might have that can't be corroborated or verified by anyone else, right? And in other words, an extremely subjective experience. So I started thinking about, as I said before, the kind of range of experiences like this that we talk about. And certainly there are the artistic experiences, the voices of the characters that come to us, the music that musicians hear, inside their heads, poets hear voices, artists see visions. These are all unshared experiences, right? That an attuned person can have, right? And then there are those voices, as the speaker just talked about, the critical voices, the abusive voices, the voices that are trying to, to shut down the creative side, perhaps, who are always telling you that you're no good and that you should just stop, and then there are and very often those voices, I certainly experience lots of those voices, but they're inside again. But if you can imagine what it would feel like to hear those voices as if they were coming from the outside of you, as if they were, as if you were hearing them with your ear, right? That would be a terrifying and potentially very, very disturbing disturbing experience. So people who are disturbed by their voices, might, for example, go seek help and describe this to a psychiatrist, at which point, in most cases, that person would then be diagnosed, right? Diagnosed as either, psychotic or schizoaffective or, schizophrenic. And then very often, there's a course of medication that's prescribed, so it becomes a very kind of medical procedure at that point. So in any case, there's this kind of spectrum that I mentioned before, on one hand, creative, somewhere in the middle, there's kind of neurotic, and then, on the other side, what's called psychotic, right? And, there's so much critique now starting, which I think is really healthy, about this kind of diagnostic culture that we live in. I'm thinking in particular about a book that has been receiving a lot of airplay now, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, right? And it's a book about trauma, and he is very, very critical of, the current psychiatric diagnostic system and also the treatment systems. And in response to this, there's a wonderful movement growing amongst people who hear voices and who think that the medicalized model, the psychopharmaceutical model of treatment is not that effective, is not helping them. And I'm talking here about, there's an international group called the International Hearing Voices Movement. Their website, I think, is intervoice.org. There's Hearing Voices USA. There are a lot of really wonderful sort of peer-based support groups that are out there investigating different ways of coping with this.
The point that you're making right now was actually, I want to share another clip with you. And this is a woman named Lisa Forrestal, who actually is a trainer, or at least at the time of that show 7 years ago, was a trainer for Hearing Voices Network USA. She's describing, I think, exactly the thing you're talking about. B2, Kat.
But I don't feel as though my voices are a creation of my experience or an extrapolation of my experience. They truly are separate souls that I hear and other people don't, just as you're a separate soul that everybody else is hearing along with me.
So it sounds almost like you're not really especially interested in some kind of clinical explanation on what this is all about.
I'm actually I get a little bit upset about that, actually. It just feels like it gets in the way from us understanding our experiences.
And you're not interested in changing or not having these voices, right?
I have never once considered not having my voices and trying to be rid of them.
So, Ruth, I love where she says it just feels like it gets in the way of us understanding our experiences, to clinicalize it. She wants to experience it the way we would experience maybe just about anything else in our lives.
I love that. I think that's wonderful. And so once again, here, we have to, I really believe that, we have this idea of what's normal and what's not normal.
Right.
And our bandwidth for normal is really, really narrow, right? But normal is a cultural construct, right? It doesn't exist. There's no such thing as normal. It's something that we made up. So if that's the case, why can't we widen it? Why can't we widen normal and make it more generous and more compassionate and more all-inclusive?
Right. I think, we've done it a little bit with so-called neurodiversity, the idea that our neurological states represent a continuum or a spectrum, but maybe not so well with the sort of comparable psychological stuff, that I think we do a little bit differently and don't. But yeah, I love her idea anyway. That so, and just to home in on what you were just saying too, the thing about culture. I mean, I don't know. It's a long time since I read Erik Erikson, but doesn't he make that point that what is schizophrenia in one culture is a shaman in another culture?
Exactly. It's celebrated in one culture and reviled or diagnosed away in another. And I should also say that we happen to live in a culture where people like me who hear voices and write them down, and they turn into novels, which are not real. They're made up, right, out of nothing, out of my imagination. In this culture, that's not only okay, it's actually celebrated. But I can imagine a culture where, that somebody who does what I do every day would be looked at as, as perverse, as criminal, as mentally ill. And people who read novels would be, novels, first of all, would be banned, and people who read them would have to do so secretly. I can also imagine that culture. And, I feel like I'm very lucky to have ended up where I am, where, I can do this, and people seem to like it.
So Ruth Ozeki has just laid out for us her dystopian novel that she'll be writing in about 10 years. You heard it here first, though. All right, we're going to take a break. Obviously, Ruth and I have nothing to talk about. The show is going so fast. I'm really alarmed because there's so many things I want to get to, and we won't get to all of them, but we'll try. We are back. It is time for me to say a thank you or two. First to Kat Pastor, who's here in the studio with me, our technical producer. She's the one that I'm shouting out all these commands to, and she is impossible to fluster. And Lily Tyson is the person who decided we were going to do this show. She's the producer of this episode, and she has done her usual thoughtful and immaculate job of producing it and of putting up with me, because occasionally I just get so excited about a show and I have 92 different ideas about stuff I want to do. And unfortunately, that means telling Lily, no, I need this. You got to get me that. So she's been great about all that. And this is a terrific show. Ruth Ozeki, a wonderful guest, a novelist and filmmaker, also professor of English language and literature at Smith College. I'm not sure we've said any of that so far. Her new book is The Book of Form and Emptiness. Previous books include My Year of Meats and A Tale for the Time Being, which is a finalist for the Booker Prize. And in some ways, I think sets up some of the themes of this book as well. Yeah, so our time is fleeting now, Ruth. But there's so one of the things that I demanded that Lily do, but I demanded it like 20 minutes ago, so it didn't happen. Was I suddenly thought about the song in Paint Your Wagon? I talk to the trees, but they never listen to me. I talk to the stars, but they never hear me. So that's a very romanticized idea of talking to nature, and I want you to say a little bit more about Zen Buddhism, I read an article about you trying to, I think you and some other people ordained some cherry trees, do I have that right, as priests? So maybe talk a little bit about sort of being you, Ruth, not a character in the world, and how that world and that kind of thinking informs your writing.
Sure. It's funny. I never know where Ruth begins, where Ruth ends, and a character begins. Yep. I feel like it's kind of a continuum here. But yeah, no, I've been practicing Zen Buddhism now for a long time. When I was I'm half Japanese, right? So the first memory I have as a small person, a very small person, I think I was 3, is of, opening a bedroom door and peeking inside and seeing my grandfather sitting on the floor, cross-legged, meditating. Right. And I think I kind of imprinted on that, like a little duckling. I also think it terrified me, but, I sort of imprinted on that. And really, like all throughout my childhood and my, teen years, I was just kind of fascinated by meditation and kept trying to do it in various different schools and ways and techniques. And then eventually came around to, or came back to Zen Buddhism when I met my current teacher, Norman Fisher, who's based in the Bay Area. And he has a group called the Everyday Zen Foundation. And so that's the group that I'm affiliated with. And, it's the type of Zen I practice is it's Japanese Zen. And so it's very informed by, sort of indigenous Japanese customs and aesthetics. And certainly the reverence or the respect for nature is something that, is just built into the tradition. There's a sense that, that everything can be our teacher, right? Trees can be our teacher, mountains can be our teacher, rivers can be our teacher, oceans, pebbles, roof tiles, blades of grass, weeds, they can all be our teacher if we let them, if we can become attuned to the things that they can teach us, right? And so this is a very, very, sort of foundational, deep sense that runs through, Zen Buddhism. And I should also mention, not just be our teachers, but that we are, intrinsically interconnected with all of the things in the world around us, right? That we cannot exist in isolation. Right. That simply is not possible, that we are simply a part of a much bigger whole. And so as a result, we learn from everything around us, if we know how to listen. And so, yes, this summer, the city of Northampton decided that I think they had money left over in their paving budget, and they decided to spend it on our street. And it's a very small street, sort of tucked way out of the way. And decided that as part of this, these 10 beautiful old Japanese cherry trees would have to be cut down. And I won't get into the long, heartbreaking story of this. And it really was traumatizing and heartbreaking. But in a kind of last ditch effort to sort of assert the rights of these trees to live, we ordained them as Zen priests. And it was a beautiful ceremony. We put robes on them, and, there were about, 200 people there who had come to celebrate with us. And so it was a very beautiful moment. Unfortunately, it didn't work. It did not save the trees. But it was still, I think, an important gesture, an important ritual to have done, because, I think we're such an anthropocentric, such a human-centric culture. And I think it's really helpful to think about, other beings in the world as having, rights like we do. They're non-human persons, and we depend on them. We can't live without trees, so let's acknowledge that. And and do our best.
That whole theme with trees has been running through my own life for the past year. I've been going through problems with two people very close to me having really severe medical crises. And I actually have developed, I would say, relationships with certain trees. Most of them are apple trees for some reason. But apple trees are also very numinous, and they sort of die this like for years in front of you. Their farmers sometimes say that apple trees don't die, they just fall over at a certain point. And so I totally get that. I want to go back to what you were saying before about sort of what teaches us in Zen Buddhism. I think the other thing that, at least the way I understand it, is that questions teach us. So many other religions provide answers. I mean, the Old Testament is just one big list of answers. But my sense is that the koan and the tradition itself is that idea that you ponder a question. And I think that also kind of funnels into some of what provided the driving force behind your novel.
That's such a great observation. Absolutely true. Yes. So many of the Zen koans are actually set up as dialogues, dialogues between two monks, two monastics, right? And they're asking each other questions and providing answers. And then they're disagreeing with each other and asking more questions, and so that kind of paradigm of asking a question and then sitting with it, right? And really just sitting with the question and letting the question sort of deeply, move into your body until an answer arises, I think is certainly part of the practice. And and as I'm saying this, I'm realizing that is also what I do when I write. So much of my writing is not about giving answers; it's about asking questions. And there's nothing like asking a question to stimulate or to sort of spark the imagination, right? And so I find myself doing that regularly as a writing practice, as well as a spiritual or Zen practice.
So we are quite tragically almost out of time, but I do want to quickly ask you a little bit about teaching too. So that you and I are having a similar experience, although mine is much more limited, but we are both teaching at the place where we went to school as undergraduates. And you're teaching writing, and it's just, I'm just sort of wondering how transferable everything that you do and experience as a writer, which seems very, very specific to you, generalizable to the human condition. But I don't know, what's it like going into the classroom and trying to sort of give wisdom about this?
Well, I don't really try to give wisdom at all. I try to elicit wisdom. The students have all the wisdom they need. They just need to learn that they have it and learn how to listen to it. Again, it's a question of, learning how to listen. And so that's what I teach them. The first thing we do in class is we learn to sit quietly, and so we do, sort of contemplative exercises, I really think put it this way, meditation and contemplative practice has been such an important part of my life. I honestly think I would not be here now if I didn't, if I hadn't learned these techniques. And I wish somebody had taught me early on. And so that's where I start with them. We do some contemplative practice, and then we sort of try to write from that place. But I also really believe that every writer has, their own way of doing it. So what's important for me is to encourage students to experiment and find out what works for them. And then once they've done that, not to stay there just because it seems right, that you find something that works, and then you kind of push against that too, and see if something else might work, and then something else might work. So there's a constant sense of challenging themselves as well. And that's, I don't know, I taught myself how to write, and that's how I did it. So I think it's almost like teaching them how to teach themselves rather than imparting any set of rules or, protocols.
All right. I can tell you're a wonderful teacher. You're also a wonderful radio guest, but we have to stop, which breaks my heart. There's so much more that we could go into. The novel is called The Book of Form and Emptiness. We didn't even get to tell you where the title comes from. I don't know. Tune in to Ruth Ozeki Part 2 on the Colin McEnroe Show, and we'll do all the stuff we didn't get to do. We're going out with more Benny Goodman. Benny Goodman plays a big role also in the background of this amazing piece of work. So, Ruth, thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Colin. That was really fun.
And bye-bye to the rest of you. Thanks to Kat. Thanks to Lily. We'll be back tomorrow.